From vaudeville to the silver screen to the small screen, the Marx Brothers made an impact wherever people found them. Now, Tom Fox and Mike Volkov bring them into the boardroom to help explain and explore the sometimes chaotic world of governance, risk management, ethics, and compliance. This is Why a Duck? Into the Compliance Soup, which is part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist, back again with Mike Volkov, the founder of the Volkov Law Group, to do, which is probably our favorite podcast, Why a Duck, where we celebrate all things Marx Brothers and talk about compliance a little bit as well. So, Michael, welcome.
Tom, good to see you. Great to be together to talk about the Marx Brothers, that's for sure.
So today we are going to start a series where our theme is the movie Coconuts. Mike, you want to set the stage for what the movie The Coconuts was, and then in subsequent podcasts we'll give some of our favorite scenes from it.
So Coconuts was the first Marx Brothers film, and it was a stage play here in New York, and 1929 turned into a film. If you watch it, it is hilarious. It obviously shows the limitations of technology at that point in time, but it really is terrific. You have the Marx Brothers in it, and of course our favorite character, Margaret Dumont, and it was adapted to the screen by the two great writers, George S. Kaufman and Maury Riskin. We have Irving Berlin Tunes in it. The plot is fantastic because it was during the Florida land boom of the 1920s. Mr. Hammer, Groucho Marx, runs the place. And by the way, he's the head of the hotel and he's never paid his employees. And the employees confront him and say, hey, we want to get paid. We want to get paid our wages. And he says, you don't want to be wage slaves, because what do you think wage slaves want? Wages. Anyways, so we have Zeppo Marx in it, who's Jameson. And then we, of course, have Chico and Harpo, who arrive with empty luggage. And when someone asks them why their luggage is empty, they said, don't worry, Chico said, don't worry, we're going to fill it up by the time we leave. So Margaret Dumont is Mrs. Potter, and it's basically probably the best. There are two famous scenes. One, which we'll talk about in another episode, is the great viaduct scene. And we also have the great scene of the land auction for Florida properties, which is run by Groucho, at which Chico is supposed to be hired to inflate the sales price. But it's a great series, a great movie, one that absolutely is terrific.
Like I said, we're going to talk about some of our favorite scenes that Mike alluded to in subsequent podcasts. But for the compliance component of this podcast, I really wanted to talk to you, Mike, about the OFAC framework for compliance. This came out between the two DOJ pronouncements, the first being the criminal division's evaluation of corporate compliance programs and the antitrust divisions, or as you would say, the divisions, criminal antitrust compliance program. I believe this came out in June. And although you are usually not one to hyperpole, you called this a game changer. Why did you think it was such an important announcement?
Well, I actually went to the ACAMS meeting this year in Las Vegas and spoke about the sanctions compliance policy. And I do think it's a game changer because not only did it elevate the requirements for sanctions compliance policies, it borrowed liberally from the Justice Department's guidance, but it really built in some new ideas. And there are several mandates that are in the sanctions compliance policy program area. One is an annual requirement to conduct training of relevant control persons. So now there are basically three mandates in the compliance sphere for training on an annual basis: sexual harassment in California, sexual harassment in New York, and now compliance with sanctions. Number two, there was a definition of what a senior that a policy has to be adopted and released and approved by senior management, that being the board or the senior management team, and you have to document the adoption and release of the program. Third, I thought the fact is that they are mandating reliance on technology, or let's say a screening system, is great, but they are requiring people, all of us, to not just adopt technology, not just rely on screening, but now we have to basically document why we picked a particular vendor. Number two, we have to test it annually to make sure that it is reliable and accurate. Because OFAC got tired of people basically coming in and saying, hey, we screened for this, but we didn't catch it. There was an error. Well, that's on us now, and there's an annual requirement to double-check your technology. And the last issue I would say on this is that they also mandated that you create basically a risk profile through the sanctions compliance technology, through your screening, that you come up with a profile based upon of your risks, and you also look at beneficial owners. So this is just really a big push on all of this, these types of issues.
Mike, I'd like to start by just adding only one point, which is for the anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance professional. There's some great information on third parties, and specifically third parties not on the sales side that we typically would look at in ABC compliance programs, but third parties on the vendor side. And that's something that is in many ways lacking, or in many cases lacking, from an ABC compliance program. And since trade sanctions would focus more on customers and vendors, it would certainly make sense that it would be in there. But it's a great way for the ABC compliance practitioner to think about how they would think through incorporating vendors and even customers into their compliance program. But the perhaps broader discussion I wanted to maybe have with you is, how do we think about how the Department of Justice and the Department of Treasury thought about this? Is there any insights that you see from Treasury building on the criminal division, perhaps the antitrust division building on either the criminal division and or OFAC? And is this sort of compliance convergence something that you think we're going to see more of as more government agencies move towards this type of approach?
Yeah, 2 points here, Tom. One is I left out perhaps one of the biggest issues from my list of mandates, and you mentioned it, is that now companies are going to be required to run a risk assessment on their supply chain. And that reflects a case that happened last year where a company got in trouble for sourcing materials unknown to them from a vendor from North Korea, and they were held liable for that. Anyways, but going to your other point, I would call it the cult of personalities in the convergence here, because a woman who was put in charge of OFAC, or under her remit as a deputy in the Treasury Department, is Sigal Manlikar, who is now leaving, but nonetheless prior to that had come from the Department of Justice, worked with Mary Jo White for years, and in the private sector, and I had the great honor to work with her. And she brought the Department of Justice's approach to compliance and enforcement to OFAC. And so she was sort of in on the DOJ thinking. She brought that, and it's clear that this was coordinated in some fashion with DOJ's thinking as well. The other point about this is, and you raised this, and I think it's prescient on your part, is that OFAC is now developing more and more contacts and a relationship with the Justice Department. And I say it's akin to what the SEC does with the Justice Department in the FCPA arena. Now we're seeing in the OFAC sanctions arena a similar relationship that is being created. So we're looking at that as well, and we're seeing the culmination of that.
Does that mean that perhaps not simply that OFAC would draw upon the experience of the Department of Justice, but the Department of Justice may now draw upon the experience of OFAC as OFAC moves forward to assess compliance programs that are created under this framework?
Absolutely. And I think that's the point here, that, to the extent SEC had their own standards and it started to influence sort of enforcement actions at the Justice Department and the FCPA, particularly when it comes to financial controls, I think we're now going to see similar type of thinking from OFAC on the details of specific compliance issues and enforcement issues that come up. Notice that OFAC incorporated into it a new push into their guidance. If you look at the guidance itself, it's a great document. It's worth reading. The idea of prosecuting more individuals. And lo and behold, just around this time, the OFAC is now prosecuting civilly more individuals. And here again, notice the parallel to the SEC. The SEC prosecutes individuals, and occasionally the department has been prosecuting more individuals, but not as many, let's say, as the SEC. But we're going to start to see an uptick in civil enforcement actions by OFAC against individuals.
I certainly see some focus in the OFAC framework that we've talked about here so far that I really think can move the ABC compliance program forward. If you had to sit down across from the Department of Justice and could cite to an example of a part of the OFAC framework you incorporated into your anti-corruption compliance program, do you feel that's an argument the Department of Justice would at least consider?
Absolutely, and that's a great point. So I think, there's so much cross-pollination here. There already is greater coordination between OFAC and the department in terms of criminal cases that are being brought in the sanctions area. We've seen some with, we've seen some with sort of government contractors who have violated sanctions laws with Iran. We've seen some criminal cases that were brought in recently in the banking case in Dubai. I think it was Standard Chartered, where we had an individual who pled guilty and an individual who was prosecuted. But I think in general, your idea of how adopting certain elements of the program from the sanctions perspective is ultimately going to benefit you in the criminal space as well.
Mike, many commentators have noted that they believe this Department of Justice is moving towards what's somewhat referred to as the light touch of corporate enforcement. But it occurs to me that if that is true regarding enforcement, we've also seen, certainly with the OFAC framework, recognizing it came from the Department of Treasury, but the two other Department of Justice frameworks for compliance programs we've referenced throughout this podcast, the department is putting out some solid information on not only expectations, but how it's going to judge a company. Is that something that you're seeing as well from the professional side, i.e. the non-political side at Justice and Treasury?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, OFAC has had a framework that they've publicized for a long time in terms of enforcement guidelines. And again, we have the same incentive, which is to the extent you have an effective compliance program for OFAC purposes at the time of the violation or at the time of the resolution, you can stand to get significant credit. It's an identified factor in the guidelines. So I think there's more and more sort of standardizing these on the criminal side, and at DOJ we have the Philip factors and we have various guidelines that are in place. What I think is happening is that there's more and more consistency as more cases are brought along. And Tom, you and I have talked about for a long time that this FCPA corporate enforcement program, which is basically turned into the corporate enforcement program, except for to the extent there are little differences with the antitrust division. This is becoming sort of the well-established framework. I don't see it changing much And I think it's going to be now decision making and discretion may go up and down within that framework, but everybody has a language and a framework now to operate in. And I think that that's going to be good for transparency and good for people, practitioners like myself and yourself, when we're trying to advise clients on, what to expect and how to formulate your presentations and your arguments to the department about a particular case.
Well, Mike, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but it's been a fascinating discussion of the OFAC framework and an introduction into one of our favorite movies, The Coconut. So I look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Why a Duck. Make sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed the episode, leave a review.